Our scripture reading this morning is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 14 through 24. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.' And he said, 'Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You know how we all get excited when someone from our hometown or even our home state makes it big and becomes famous. Like actor Andy Griffith from the small North Carolina town of Mount Airy. I remember going down to Manteo when he was making an episode of Matlock. I was so excited, and I was equally disappointed when I could not shake his hand and get his autograph. Or like the gold medal winner and the most well-known non-heavyweight champion boxer, Sugar Ray Leonard. Born Ray Charles Leonard and named after that famous singer because his mama loved Ray Charles. While I'm sure his birth certificate could solve the debate, both Wilmington and Rocky Mount clamor to claim that he was born in their city. Or Michael Jordan, whom some claim is one of the all-time greatest basketball players. He may not have been born in Wilmington, but he was brought up there, and he did play on their high school basketball team. When someone from our hometown makes a name, a good name for him or herself, we all celebrate. We tell stories. Like a colleague of mine, when Michael Jordan retired, I think it was his second time of retiring from basketball. He said, "I remember watching Michael play when his team played the Kinston High School basketball team." Or like my great aunt used to tell me, "I remember Andy before he was famous. We taught school together." We brag a little. We're kind of proud. Everyone comes from somewhere, and this or that famous person came from the same place we come from, we like to say. It is especially exciting when we live in a small town where everybody knows everybody and we can gossip about one another's family secrets, so that we name the famous person and then we say, "I just can't believe that his brother is such a troublemaker." Or we say, "Her granddaddy sure is lucky that my Aunt Susie didn't press charges when he stole that chewing gum as a little boy." You know, sometimes we have the memory of elephants for those things that families would rather us sweep under the rug or hide away in the closet. when someone makes it big, we're all pleased and proud as if he or she were one of our very own family members. They come back to town, and the banners go up, and people line the streets like it's the Christmas parade. That's the way it was in this one small town synagogue on a Sabbath morning. The crowds had come because Joseph's little boy had made it big. He was the talk of the countryside. Everybody in the region was swearing that he was the very best preacher they have ever heard. He really makes you think, some would say. Others would claim that they had never felt closer to God than when they were in the crowd listening to him talking about God. They would say, when I hear him talk about God's love for each and every one of us, I just know it's true. When the word reached their tiny town that this famous preacher and teacher was coming home for a visit, they couldn't stop talking about him. Can't you just imagine one of his Sabbath school teachers saying, "You know who taught him about the prophets, don't you?" I did. And in my class, he memorized Psalm 23 and Psalm 100. His school teacher may have said he couldn't even recite the alphabet when he came into my class. Now, just look at him. Even his priest may have gotten in on it, pointing out, "You know where he learned about God, don't you?" That's right here in this very synagogue. We taught him. Oh, they were so proud. He was coming home to visit. Maybe they could ask him to participate in worship. They were so excited. That Sabbath, he came with all of his family. He was sitting right there with Mary and all his brothers and sisters in their regular pew. We can imagine that when he came in, he spoke to Mr. Johnson back on the back row. Mr. Johnson came to the synagogue every single Sabbath. He would not miss a Sabbath day, but he often snored through the service. And Jesus, he spoke to Mrs. Lewis. She was the town mayor. And of course, as we imagine him entering, he spoke to Mrs. Mitchell, and he gave her a big hug too. She was that old Sabbath Sunday school teacher, and he always had a special place in her heart. The old Sabbath teacher did. Everyone saw her as a woman of prayer, in fact. The pews were filled with good-hearted people, some of them deeply spiritual, and a number who saw the synagogue as a type of liability insurance, just in case they needed it to erase the mistakes and get into heaven. There were those who did their duty, and they checked church off the list of important things that must be done, like brushing their teeth. And others who went because they cherished their relationship with God, and they could not imagine life without the presence of God's love. Well, then it came time for the scripture reading. That day the text was from Isaiah, and it was a prophetic text about one who would set the captives free and restore sight to the blind. This famous native son was handed the scroll. He opened it up, he scrolled a little up and then a little more. Every one of them, even Mr. Johnson, who was usually fast asleep at this point, every one of them watched as he found the right place in the text. And then he read it. As clear as day, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. God has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." No one noticed that this text told of the same things that this man had been doing all along the countryside. No one noticed, as he read, that he was the one who was bringing the good news in all his stories about the reign of God. Nor did they make the connection that he was the one doing the miracles, like bringing sight to the blind. They did not see that his words of social justice about the oppressed were making a difference in the lives of those who were so often overlooked by society. Or did they notice? All eyes were fixed on him. The room was so quiet they could have heard a pin drop as he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. All eyes were on him. And he did not say a word until he realized that the service had stopped right there with his sitting down. So he spoke the obvious. He said, "Today, the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And they were amazed. Mr. Johnson may have leaned over to Ms. Mitchell and said, with a hint of awe in his voice, "Is this not Joseph's son?" They whispered among themselves. Some of them even dared to quote his family tree of good people. And a prostitute. And a murderer. Is this not just Joseph's son? The tide had quickly turned from awe and amazement to disbelief and even disdain. The service did not go on. So he spoke again. And he reminded them that he was a prophet, and that no prophet, no matter how real and true, no prophet was accepted in his hometown. The words of Scripture and his proclamation that it was true and real and happening right before their eyes, this was too much for them. It challenged them. They wanted a nice, comforting, easy message from their hometown boy. They wanted something that would enable them to pat themselves on the back. This is not what they wanted. These words meant that change was happening. These words meant that things were not going to be as they always were. These words meant that that little boy they had watched grow up was about to change the world. These words scared them because they meant that faith was not a 1-hour Sabbath morning thing to check off the list. It was real. These words meant that they could not sleep through life and expect all of forever to simply fall into place all on its own. This is not just Joseph's son. It would be easier if the answer were yes. But this is also God's child, our Messiah. Maybe it would have been easier if he left that scroll all neatly rolled up, gathering dust on the bookshelf. But no, he told them the truth. After all, they were the people of his hometown, in his home synagogue. They had taught him about life and about God. He told them the truth, and they would do with it whatever they chose. Maybe he hoped they would choose to believe in the love and power and grace of God. Maybe he hoped that they would accept the challenge and change the world with him. Jesus came to the world as one of us. He demonstrated God's love and showed us that such honest compassion can change the world. What do we do? Do we listen? Do we hear this message? Does it challenge us? Does it change us? Do we open our hearts to God? Is this Joseph's son? Or is this just Joseph's son?